we're going to start our Mantra Monday. So happy evening to you if you are Central Standard Time in the US. If you're from somewhere else, hopefully it's not too early or too late for you. Today's Mantra Monday, we're going to create this painting. It says, I am at peace. So today we're going to work on a gradient. So what you will need for class today is some sort of watercolor paper. I'm using a 5x7. If you have a watercolor notebook that's closer to an 8x10 or 9x12, I suggest that you divide it in half. Today, since we're just using, we're going to be using a lot of water, and so if you're trying it on a full sheet of paper, you're more than welcome to try on a full sheet of paper, but it could affect the drying times if you work a little bit larger. You will also need your watercolor paints, same as normal. You are going to need a smaller brush. I'm using a round size 6. And you're also going to need a larger brush today that you can use to wet your paper for our gradient. So if you have a larger brush that just holds a little bit more water, you can use that. If you have a specialty brush, this is called a hockey brush. It's spelled H-A-K-E. They're made in Japan. They're for wetting large portions of paper very, very easily. You can use this as well. Since I'm working on a 5x7, this is just a little bit too big for a 5x7. So I'm going to be using this size for wetting my paper. You'll need a pencil and an eraser. And we'll also be using a micron permanent marker. I'm going to be using a size 03. And for the water that you'll need, I always like to have 2 glasses of water. Today, we're going to be starting with very clean water, so make sure that the cup that you're using for water is really nice and clean, so you have clean, clear water. And of course, a rag or a paper towel, something to be able to clean your brush or to tap off any extra water. So let me change this so you can see what we're doing. And I'll move all my stuff out of the way so that it's a little easier for you to see. All right, so before we start, I do want to kind of just explain a little bit what sort of techniques we're going to use before we start. So today we're going to be looking a lot at painting wet on wet. So by wet on wet, that means that we need to wet our paper first, and then we're going to be adding wet paint onto that wet area. So in order to wet our area, there's 2 things that we can do. We can either wet the entire paper, and then we would have to have our paper either taped down somehow or stapled to a board, or we can leave a little bit of dry paper around the outside. And that's what I decided to do, just so that I didn't have to worry about stapling my paper onto a wooden board. So we will wet our paper, but notice that I'm only going to be wetting up into leaving a little bit of a margin here, okay? You can go all the way to the edge, but I think it looks a lot cleaner if you can leave a little bit of a white border. All right, so let's start with our pencil. We're first going to make sure that we leave a little space at the bottom for our mantra. Our mantra this week is I am at peace, and I decided to use this mantra because I have been working on filing my taxes as a small business owner, and it is extremely stressful. I'm not sure if any of you have experience with your taxes as a small business, but it's pretty stressful. So I decided that this week I need a mantra that's going to remind me to breathe, and to breathe in peace, and to breathe out, exhale, stress. So this is what I'm going to have at my desk all week. All right, so let's start by drawing a line towards the bottom of our paper where our mantra is going to be. And we're going to start by writing our words, or writing our mantra so that we leave enough space. I am at peace. Breathing in peace and exhaling stress. All right, now that you're done as well, now we can move on to the painting part. Now, before we wet our paper, I want to make sure that all of my colors are ready for me to use. That way I know that I have them all set and I'm not going to have to re-wet my paper at all. So we're going to move this over. We're going to mix our colors first. The colors that I decided to use are a dusty blue that's going to slowly turn into this magenta, this dusty magenta. And then I'm also using a yellowish, well, it's more of a yellow, but it has a little hint of an orange. So we're going to get these three colors ready. I'm not going to worry about my hearts yet because that's going to be the next layer. So first, let's get some water onto our palette. We're going to need quite a bit of water down first. Now we can start mixing our colors. So in order to make this dusty blue, I'm going to use, this is a phthalo blue from Daniel Smith. And then to the phthalo blue, in order to make it a little dusty, I'm going to use a little bit of brown. So down here towards the bottom, I have a brown, any brown will do. And you'll be able to see at home that the color is going to be a little less bright. So we're not going to have as vibrant of a color here. And when I show you what it looks like on my palette, it's actually, well, it's a dusty blue. The more brown you add, the more muddy it's going to look. All right, so I'm happy with that color. If you want at home, if you're not sure what it's going to look like on a sheet of paper, you can always test your color on an extra sheet of paper so that you know that it's the right hue that you want. And I think I do like that hue. I don't want it too brown since it's going to be a sky color. So now in a different section of my palette, I'm going to mix my magenta. And same thing, I have to bring a few paintbrushfuls of water onto my palette. Now I'm going to grab my magenta. This is one of my favorite colors of Daniel Smith. It's a quinacridone magenta. At some point in my life, I need to figure out what these words mean. Quinacridone and phthalo. I have a feeling it has to do with the type of pigment they use, but I'm not sure. If you know, leave me a comment. Then I'm going to dusty it up, so I'm going to add a little bit of brown. And when I add my brown, that's just going to lessen the brightness of the color. Once again, I can check it on my sheet of paper to see if it's the right hue of color that I want. So just so you can see the difference, here's quinacridone without brown. So you can tell quite a difference. It just kind of takes away that brightness. And for me personally, I think my design style, I tend to like these more subdued colors, just a little bit more. All right, and our last color that we're going to mix right now, I actually don't need to mix this color, but you might have to mix it at home. So I'm going to be using a color that's called New Gamboge. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It's a color by Daniel Smith. It's a pretty bright yellow, but it's not like a sun yellow. So it does have a little bit of orange in this color, as you can tell by when you test it on paper. So whatever yellow you have, if your yellow is a little bit brighter, add a little bit of either orange or just a really tad bit of red to the color. So this is a different yellow that I have. This is a new Hansa yellow, which is more of a lemon yellow. It's a very, very bright yellow. So we're looking more for this yellow that's got a little bit of a red hue to it. All right, so once you have your colors all set, now we are all ready to start with our wet on wet painting. So I'm going to put my round size 6 brush to the side, and I'm going to find a slightly larger capacity brush that can hold a little bit more water. And I'm going to make sure that the water that I am using is crystal clear. I don't want any pigment in this water. So if you need to run to the sink and grab a new cup of water, you can go do that. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to be wetting the area that I'm going to create the gradient in. You're going to have to use quite a bit of water. I noticed my brush, I don't clean my brushes very well. You're going to use quite a bit of water, and remember, you're not going to paint all the way to the edge. You're going to leave a little bit of white around the edge, the same down at the bottom here. I'm not going to wet my paper all the way to my words, because remember, anywhere that we have water, the pigment will run into that area. Now, if you are using a paper that's larger than a 5x7, you're going to notice that it is going to be bending and curling quite a bit, which is why I'm using a smaller sheet of paper, because that bend and curl is not going to be nearly as bad in a 5x7. If you get frustrated at all by the curl of the paper, you can always, since we left that edge, you can always use some tape and tape your paper down. I'm not going to, only because I'm actually going to be lifting my paper up in order to kind of move the pigment a little bit. If you want to tape yours down, feel free. Now I'm going over the area that I wet a few times, only because I really want the water to soak into the paper. The paper that I'm using today is a cold press, so it's not quite as smooth. All right, and you can see that it's pretty wet, but when I pick it up, it's not going to be pooling in any area. What does that mean? If I add too much water and I lift it up, you can see how there's going to be kind of a pool that's coming to the corner here. I don't want that pool of water. So if you do have your water pooling, dry off your brush and just lift it up slightly. Wherever the water is pooling, the pigment is going to go there. So if we have a big pool of water, it's not going to be a very smooth gradient. All right, so I'm checking my corners, making sure I don't have anything pooling up. All right, I think I'm ready to go. So I'm going to hold my paper on the corners, just so it's not bending up the whole way. And I'm going to start always at the top with the darkest pigment. So I'm going to start with my blue. I'm going to switch brushes, although really for this part I don't really have to switch brushes. You know what? I'm going to use my big brush still. I'm going to grab some of my blue pigment, my blue paint that I mixed earlier, and I'm going to start at the top. And I'm going to use very soft movements. I'm going to slowly bring the pigment down. Now you can tell that some is already running here. So I'm going to clean my brush, dry it off completely with my towel, and I'm going to lift some of that pigment from spreading down. That's what happens if you have some water pooling. is that the pigment's automatically going to come down to that area. Now, I'm going to stop with the pigment about a third of the way down. And instead, I'm going to use a drier brush. So I did dry it off a little bit. And I'm going to pull just the pigment with the dry brush down about to halfway. The reason I'm doing that is I'm going to start with a different color next. And so I don't want too much pigment on my brush. Otherwise, it's going to create a gradient that it'll just look different than what I did. So now I'm ready to switch to a different color. So I'm going to clean my brush off completely. And I'm going to switch to my magenta. I am going to leave this little in-between area because the magenta that I have on my brush is quite concentrated. So I'm not going to start so close to my blue, or otherwise my pigment is going to spread upwards a little bit more than what I want. So I'm actually going to start just below where the blue pigment ends. I can always move my brush upwards. It's a little bit more difficult, though, to take the color away once it's already started mixing. All right, same thing. I think I might add just a little bit more pigment. Now, you can play around with this. Obviously, the more pigment that you add, the more it's going to spread. But for now, I'm going to clean my brush. I'm going to dry it off. If I come in with a wet brush now, what's going to happen? It's going to release the water onto my paper, and it's going to create a bloom that's going to push the pigment away. So I'm going to have to use a clean brush in order to combine these two sections and create this gradient. Clean it off. And then I'm going to stop. The more I work this in-between area, sometimes the more that it actually messes it up. So I'm going to stop there. And now at the very bottom, before this dries completely, I'm going to add my yellow down in this bottom area. So now I'm going to grab some yellow. And I'm only going to do it in this lower corner. I have quite a bit of concentrated yellow on my brush. You can choose if you'd like to bring it all the way out. Maybe I will bring it slightly all the way out. Doing gradients like this is a great way to really experiment with watercolor. I'm going to clean my brush, and I do want to pull this yellow towards the corner. Once again, I have to dry my brush slightly, and then I can pull it to the corner and mix with this magenta above. Remember that if I do have a wet brush and I try to pull that wetness, it's going to disperse my pigment. You can also play around with this if you want to lift it up and have some of your pigment run. You can see what that does to your piece. If you want it to be completely even, you can dry your brush off and lift a little of the pigment wherever it's pooling. Lift and dry. Maybe I'll grab a little bit of this yellow down here. Lift and dry. And now, before it dries completely, I do want to lift up some of the pigment to create kind of some clouds here. I know that this blue is already kind of starting to dry. With a clean, dry brush, I'm going to come in and I'm going to just lift some of that pigment in kind of a upward arc, lower arc fashion. And that's going to create what looks like clouds. Now, I can clean my brush off, but in between cleans, I do have to dry it off. If I come in with a wet brush, it's going to move the pigment and create blooms. I can basically lift it in whatever areas I want to create whatever kinds of clouds I want. If you want to see what it looks like to create a bloom and what it would look like, feel free to take a drop of water and drop it down. But what you're going to see happen is the pigment is going to disperse greatly. I'm trying to find an example here. And you'll create a bloom that looks more like this. Okay? That's why we have to use a dry brush. You might have to go back in every once in a while. Now from this area, from the sun, now I'm going to try to create these kind of sun rays. Same thing, completely dry brush that's cleaned off. And I'm going to create the rays from the sun. I am going to clean it in between. If you are not able to do this yet because your paper's dried, you can try rewetting your paper. It is more difficult to re-wet it once you have color down, and it could completely ruin it. This is something you might just have to try a few times before you really get the hang of it, and that's okay. It is challenging. I still don't know completely what's going to happen when I lay down color or pull it up. Now that I pulled the color off of this area, now I can take some pigment and add some of that yellow back in. But I have to be extremely careful when I do. So I have to make sure that the pigment that I lay down doesn't have too much water. Because once again, if you lay down with a brush that's full of water, it might give you blooms. So before you start painting it, tap it on your paper towel a few times and then test it out. Ooh, that kind of gave me a lot of yellow. I'm gonna lift a little bit more up. See what I mean by this is a very gradient, is difficult. It's something that you will continue to work on. And honestly, I think what happened is I needed to have started on the sun a little bit earlier. Started drying too much because I was talking too much. Cleaning it off. Pulling pigment up. So for this one, it's going to be just a little bit more pronounced, these sun rays. I had a little bit less of the pink in my original. You can see I had quite a bit less pink. And so, of course, when I lift up the color, then it's going to look a little bit more intense. I'm going to leave it there, though, because the more that I work on it, honestly, sometimes the worse it gets. I'm going to let it dry. I can always come back in, and I can always take out some of that pink behind there. But it's really hard to work once you've laid color down. Anything that you add wetness-wise is could end up really hurting your piece. All right. A few more clouds here. Just kind of play around. This is definitely a time to be playing around and to see what happens. So what would have happened if I would have brought this color up a little bit more? All right, so as we let this dry a little bit, I'm going to use my Micron pen to add I Am at Peace on underneath. All right. Now, we will have to wait until our paint is dry in order to add these hearts on top. It does seem like my blue is most of the way dry because, of course, I started first. I can tell that it's dry because when I lift it up to the light and try to find a shiny, the shiny water, I do not see any shine. I can see still a little bit of shine down by the yellow though, so I know that it's not quite ready down by the yellow. I'm going to start though on my little hearts, and these hearts, we didn't draw anything out if you noticed. You can add whatever you want here. If you want to leave it like this, you can leave it like that. I just added the hearts because it was kind of along the same style as some of the other paintings that we've done for Mantra Monday. Just kind of some hearts floating in the sky. And doing this is also a good way to cover up any sort of mistakes that you made. So I'm just going to add a few hearts on top. Really in no real order. Just basically wherever you want. Using this dusty magenta. Now I do like to add quite a bit of pigment here. There's actually quite a bit of water because I do like the effect and what it looks like when it dries. And as we're painting these hearts, we can always be thinking about what this mantra means. That we're breathing in peace and exhaling stress. All right. And I think I am going to cover some of these sun rays here just to kind of break them up. Now, gradients are definitely a great way to be practicing when you're just starting out with watercolors to practice at, when your paper is ready for pigment, what the paint does at different levels of wetness. You really learn a lot as you're doing gradients with wet on wet. All right. And as always, I always have to tell myself at some point to stop. It's probably the hardest part as an artist is figuring out where to stop. And I think I'm done there. So I know that this was a very short Mantra Monday today, looking at gradients, but I hope you learned a little something about how to create these even gradients and a few tips. Next week, we're going to do another pretty easy painting for Mantra Monday. We're going to be painting this rainbow that says I am enough, and you can choose the colors that you use, or otherwise you can always use the same colors that we've been using this whole time. But for now, remember, every time you see this mantra this week, remember to breathe in peace and exhale stress. All right, I will see you next week. Have a great week. Bye, everyone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please follow me on social media, check out my website, and make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel.